It was August 17th, 2025, when a man stumbled out of the Cambodian jungle near Koh Kong province, barefoot and barely recognizable as human. His clothes were in tatters, hanging from his skeletal frame, and his skin was torn by deep scars and insect bites. Locals from a nearby fishing village first spotted him as he staggered along the muddy riverbank, half collapsing with every step. At first they thought he was just another illegal logger gone wrong or a poacher injured in the jungle's unforgiving terrain. But when he finally looked up, there was something unsettling in his eyes, a hollow, haunted vacancy that made even the bravest step back. When asked his name, the man rasped out two words, almost like he'd forgotten how to speak: Daniel Price. That name was already infamous in Cambodia. 7 years ago, Daniel and 3 friends had vanished without a trace while trekking through the Cardamom Mountains, one of Southeast Asia's most remote and impenetrable jungles. Despite one of the largest search operations in Cambodian history, no bodies, no gear, and no clues were ever found. For years, families mourned, investigators speculated, and conspiracy theories multiplied. But now, Daniel Price was here, alive. He was rushed to a nearby clinic, IV tubes hooked to his thin arms, where police and government officials quickly surrounded his bed. When asked where he had been all this time and what had happened to his friends, Daniel trembled violently, whispering only one sentence before collapsing into exhaustion. "They're still out there, and it's not over." 7 years earlier, in June 2018, Daniel Price was 27 and restless, living out of a backpack and chasing adventures across Southeast Asia. He had convinced 3 close friends to join him on one final trip before adulthood inevitably caught up to them: Maya Roberts, his college roommate and photographer; Lucas Tran, a self-proclaimed adrenaline junkie; and Aaron Calloway, the quiet one with an obsession for forgotten places. Their plan was simple: a 2-week trek deep into the untouched wilderness of Cambodia's Cardamom Mountains, an area so remote it's often called one of the last great unexplored jungles on Earth. On June 11th, they boarded a rickety night bus from Phnom Penh to Koh Kong, laughing over cheap beers and snapping grainy photos. The next day, they posted one last Instagram update, a blurry shot of Daniel standing barefoot on a jungle trail, sweat soaking his shirt, grinning into the sun. The caption read, "Off-grid for a few days." It was the last time anyone ever heard from them. When they failed to check in at their hostel 3 days later, relatives tried calling, but all phones went straight to voicemail. Cambodian authorities launched an initial search, but the jungle is vast, its canopy swallowing helicopters whole. Local guides warned that trails disappear overnight here, erased by storms and shifting undergrowth. At first, everyone assumed it was an accident, a wrong turn, maybe a flash flood, but investigators quickly discovered strange inconsistencies in the timeline, and nothing about this disappearance was as simple as it seemed. By June 14th, 2018, all digital footprints stopped cold. The group's WhatsApp chat, usually buzzing with jokes and plans, went silent. Daniel's sister, Claire, sent a casual message that morning: "How's the jungle? Don't get eaten, LOL." It was marked delivered, but never read. Maya's last outgoing text, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. the night before, was stranger: a single photo of an oil lamp glowing in the dark, captioned simply, "Found this place." No one knew what she meant. The geotag, when examined later, placed them somewhere beyond mapped hiking routes, deeper inside the Cardamom Mountains than expected. Locals at a remote river market later reported seeing the group early on June 14th. They had stopped for water, rice, and mosquito coils. Witnesses recalled how sweaty and exhausted they looked, but also how oddly quiet they were. Lucas, usually the loudest of the 4, barely spoke, while Erin clutched her journal tightly, glancing at the tree line as though she expected someone, or something, to appear at any moment. A shopkeeper remembered overhearing Daniel asking in broken Khmer if there was another way south, avoiding the main trail. That was the last confirmed sighting. By morning, their footprints along the riverside path vanished, swallowed by heavy rain overnight. Searchers later discovered what looked like drag marks in the mud near an animal crossing, but could never confirm whether they belonged to the group or local wildlife. Strangest of all, one sandal was found hanging from a low branch just above the riverbank, as though deliberately placed there. Investigators marked it in their logs, but couldn't explain why anyone would leave it like that. By June 15th, calls went unanswered. Inboxes remained untouched, and the group seemed to dissolve into the jungle itself. What started as an adventurous trek now felt like the beginning of something far darker and infinitely more complex. By June 16th, panic had set in. When none of the four checked in at their Kokong hostel, the families called Cambodian authorities, who launched an immediate search. At first, it seemed straightforward. 4 missing hikers lost in thick jungle. But the terrain fought back. Helicopters swept the dense canopy, but visibility was nearly zero under the emerald roof of towering dipterocarps. Rescue dogs were flown in from Thailand, struggling against sweltering humidity and leech-infested mud. Days later, trackers from local villages joined the search, skilled in navigating the unseen pathways most outsiders never discover. The operation expanded rapidly. Military units scanned logging trails for fresh tire tracks, and park rangers paddled along tributaries searching for overturned canoes. But every lead dissolved into nothing. Then came the first unsettling discovery. The group's planned route didn't match where they'd actually been seen. Their hostile logbook showed an intended southbound loop toward Tatai, but witness reports placed them far west, headed toward the deeper interior where few outsiders ever go. Rumors spread quickly through the nearby villages. Some whispered about poachers running illegal wildlife markets. Others spoke more softly of forbidden zones deeper inside the mountains, places locals refused to enter after dark. One elder even warned investigators, "The forest keeps what it wants." After 8 grueling days, search coordinators admitted the obvious. There was zero trace of the group, no bodies, no campfires, not even a scrap of clothing. The cardamom jungle had swallowed them whole, and no one could explain how 4 people could simply cease to exist. On June 22nd, 9 days after the friends vanished, a small team of Cambodian rangers, following a narrow tributary, made the first significant discovery. Deep in the shadows of the cardamom canopy, barely 30 meters from the riverbank, they found what appeared to be the group's campsite. At first glance, it was a relief, proof they'd made it this far. But the longer the team examined the site, the less sense it made. 2 backpacks lay propped neatly against a tree, still zipped and untouched. Inside were clean clothes, bottles of iodine, and half-filled journals written by Maya and Aaron. A cheap tent sat collapsed in the mud as though abandoned mid-setup, while a few cooking utensils had been scattered nearby. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no overturned earth. But then the strangeness began to reveal itself. In the center of the clearing, someone had arranged a perfect circle of stones, each roughly the same size and spaced with unnatural precision. Around the perimeter of the circle, faint depressions suggested that smaller objects, sticks perhaps or candles, had once been placed there but were now missing. Rangers also noticed symbols carved into 3 surrounding trees, each identical. A spiral enclosed within an uneven triangle, its grooves smoothed by recent touch. The marks were shallow but deliberate, and investigators would later confirm they didn't match any known Khmer tribal symbols or animal markings. Even more disturbing was what they found above the riverbank. A single boot wedged into the fork of a tree branch nearly 2 meters off the ground, as though someone had carefully placed it there. Tests later confirmed it belonged to Lucas. Stranger still, there were no other footprints anywhere around the camp, not even the group's own. Heavy rainfall might have washed them away, but trackers noted the surrounding mud was firm and undisturbed, as if the forest itself had swallowed every trace. The discovery raised more questions than answers, and for many searchers, this was the first moment they realized they weren't just dealing with an accident. Something else had happened here. By the following day, whispers began circulating among the local volunteers assisting the search teams. Some refused to return to the clearing after seeing the stone circle, muttering under their breath about spirits of the mountain. According to the elders of a nearby village, the area surrounding the Cardamom interior is cursed, a place where entire villages had vanished hundreds of years ago, leaving nothing but empty huts reclaimed by vines. One elder told investigators an old legend: the forest chooses who stays. Once it marks you, the path out disappears. He warned them about Niak Ta Prea Kamao, an ancient guardian spirit said to punish trespassers who cross forbidden boundaries. Outsiders laughed, but among locals it was no joke. Searchers from nearby communes openly avoided certain trails after dark, and one tracker quietly left the expedition altogether, refusing to explain why. Investigators dismissed these warnings as folklore, insisting there had to be a logical explanation: poachers, rogue guides, maybe even ritual scavengers. But privately, some admitted unease. The campsite was too deep, too remote, and the precision of the stone circle too deliberate to be accidental. Then came a troubling discovery from the air. Drone footage revealed several more spiraled symbols carved into tree trunks along an unmarked trail leading further west, symbols identical to those around the campsite. Yet when rangers hiked out to investigate, the path seemed to shift. Landmarks noted on GPS didn't align with reality, and one team became disoriented for hours before managing to retrace their steps. As daylight faded, a senior ranger advised halting operations overnight. But as they packed up, one volunteer swore he heard something deep within the jungle. Distant, rhythmic drumming, faint but deliberate, as though coming from miles away. Others claimed they didn't hear it. For the first time, even the most skeptical investigators began to wonder if the locals' warnings weren't superstition after all, but history. By June 24th, the official search effort had shifted from rescue to recovery. As days stretched into weeks without fresh leads, a new theory began circulating among Cambodian authorities: foul play. The Cardamom Mountains are breathtaking, but they're also lawless. Vast swathes of jungle remain unpatrolled, and investigators quietly admitted the area was home to more than just endangered wildlife. Illegal logging gangs operate deep in the interior, stripping centuries-old rosewood trees to sell on the black market. Locals whispered about wildlife traffickers capturing pangolins, sun bears, and even tiger cubs to smuggle into Vietnam and China. Rangers warned of militant poachers, armed groups willing to defend their hunting territories with lethal force. Lead investigator Colonel Somchai privately told the families what many feared: if they wandered into the wrong area, someone might have made sure they didn't leave. Witness accounts from villages downstream added weight to his suspicion. 2 fishermen reported hearing what sounded like gunfire the night after the group was last seen. Another claimed to have spotted unfamiliar men moving through the forest carrying machetes and sacks, avoiding the marked trails entirely. But if the group had crossed paths with poachers or traffickers, why leave the campsite untouched? Why arrange a stone circle? Why carve symbols into the trees? None of it matched the profile of an ambush or robbery. The backpacks were zipped. Money was untouched. No drag marks suggested a struggle. Some investigators theorized the group may have stumbled into forbidden territory, accidentally crossing paths with something they weren't meant to see. An unmarked encampment, perhaps, or a smuggling route. Others wondered if the campsite had been staged, a deliberate attempt to mislead searchers. Still, there were no footprints, no blood, no trail. The jungle was silent, and silence here was louder than anything else. On June 26th, investigators recovered a shattered Nikon camera from the abandoned campsite, its lens cracked but SD card intact. Forensic specialists in Phnom Penh carefully extracted the files, expecting to find harmless snapshots of waterfalls, campsites, and sweaty smiles. Instead, what they uncovered sent ripples through the entire investigation. Most photos were ordinary: shots of Maya sketching under a tree, Lucas balancing on a fallen log, Aaron laughing beside the river. But the final image, time-stamped June 13th at 6:42 p.m., froze everyone in the lab. It showed the four friends posing on a narrow jungle path, faces bright with sunburn and exhaustion. But behind them, partially obscured by dense foliage, stood a blurred figure. At first glance, it could have been a shadow, but when enhanced, details emerged. A tall silhouette just beyond the tree line, unmoving, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its arms appeared stiff, hanging close to its body, and there was something off about its proportions. Forensic technicians confirmed the figure was not one of the hikers. Everyone in the photo was accounted for. Rangers cross-referenced witness statements, but no one had reported other trekkers in the area that day. When investigators returned to the path to replicate the shot, they couldn't find where the figure had stood. The foliage was dense, yet drone scans suggested a narrow hidden trail ran behind the spot. That trail led deeper west, toward an unmapped sector of the jungle known to locals as Preuch Neang, or the Forbidden Hollow. What unsettled investigators most wasn't just the presence of the figure, but the expressions on the hikers' faces. Zooming in revealed Maya glancing sideways, her brow furrowed. Aaron's smile looked forced, tight. Only Daniel stared straight at the camera, unaware. Hours later, the forensic lab reported something stranger still. Metadata, hidden within the SD card, suggested 4 deleted images had been wiped, manually. Someone had tried to erase part of the story. By July 1st, frustration had reached its breaking point. The official investigation had stalled, its progress slowed by bureaucracy, language barriers, and unrelenting terrain. Cambodian authorities insisted they were doing everything possible, but the families weren't convinced. Lucas Tran's father, Henry, was the first to confront the lead investigator directly. "If this were 4 Cambodian kids, you'd have found them already," he snapped, his voice trembling with rage. Colonel Somchai, stoic and unflinching, repeated the same line he'd been using for days. "The jungle hides what it wants to hide." Behind closed doors, the families clashed constantly. Maya's parents accused the authorities of withholding information. Daniel's sister demanded U.S. Embassy intervention. Aaron's mother, meanwhile, quietly believed her daughter was already dead, a remark that caused an explosive argument with Lucas's father, who refused to accept anything less than a rescue. With faith in local authorities collapsing, Henry took matters into his own hands. Using family savings and connections from his time in the Marines, he hired a private tracker, Jack Carver, a former U.S. Special Forces operative who had spent years working security in Southeast Asia. Carver had a reputation for going places most wouldn't, for finding people others couldn't. By July 3rd, Carver had arrived at the Cardamom Mountains staging site, studying satellite maps and interviewing villagers. Where authorities had followed marked trails, Carver focused on what wasn't marked, the forgotten paths and hunters' routes, missing from any official registry. He pored over Maya's final text, the one showing the oil lamp, and cross-referenced the geotag with historic logging maps. His conclusion was unsettling. The group's last known location was far off established trekking routes, deep inside territory officially labeled restricted. Carver believed they hadn't just gotten lost. They'd been led somewhere. On July 6th, after 3 days of combing satellite images and hiking unmarked paths, Jack Carver made his first breakthrough. Aerial footage revealed what he suspected was a concealed entry point, a narrow gap in the jungle canopy leading to a ridge untouched by modern mapping. Locals avoided it entirely, calling it Phnom Chanang, the mountain that swallows. Carver hiked there alone, armed only with a machete, GPS, and a single bottle of water. Within an hour, the rainforest sounds shifted. The familiar buzz of cicadas and distant bird calls faded into a heavy silence, broken only by the crunch of his boots on damp leaves. Then, tucked behind a curtain of vines, he found it. A hidden path no wider than his shoulders, carved unnaturally straight through the dense undergrowth. The surrounding foliage bore signs of deliberate clearing, freshly cut branches, trampled earth. Someone had been here recently. Following the trail deeper, Carver made 3 unsettling discoveries. First, he spotted ropes braided from wild vines, stretched between trees like crude guidelines, leading deeper west. Second, he uncovered a cluster of improvised torches, made from bamboo stalks wrapped in resin-soaked cloth, half burnt and discarded in the mud. Finally, just before sunset, Carver found something that stopped him cold, a series of spiraled symbols carved into a boulder at the trail's bend, the same markings discovered at the abandoned campsite. Snapping photos, Carver returned to the staging site after nightfall, soaked in sweat and crawling with leeches. He told Henry only one thing before collapsing into his tent. They weren't wandering, they were following someone. By July 8th, Jack Carver returned to the concealed path with a small team of local trackers. The deeper they pushed into the cardamom interior, the more oppressive the jungle became. The canopy blotting out daylight, the air thick with damp heat and the metallic tang of decay. The silence was unnatural. Even the birds had gone quiet. 2 hours in, Carver noticed a subtle change in the terrain. A cluster of limestone outcroppings hidden behind strangler figs. One narrow crevice caught his eye, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, the beam of his flashlight cut across a shallow cave no larger than a small bedroom. At first glance, it was unremarkable. Moss-coated walls, damp earth, roots pushing through stone. Then they saw the drawings. Across the walls, in fading charcoal, someone had scrawled crude hand-drawn maps of the surrounding jungle. Some were small, showing single ridges or rivers. Others stretched nearly floor to ceiling, depicting entire valleys and tributaries with shocking detail. The maps weren't random. They matched the team's GPS data perfectly, except for one thing. Every path leading west was marked with the same spiraled triangle symbol carved into the campsite trees. Some were circled, others crossed out, and a few had annotations in an unfamiliar script. Beside one map, a faded charcoal sketch depicted 4 stick figures standing at the edge of a clearing, drawn beneath a crude canopy of trees. Opposite them, half hidden in the shadows, were several taller shapes, featureless, standing in rigid formation. Beneath the drawing, someone had scrawled words in English, jagged and rushed. "Do not follow the lights." Carver took photos of everything, but a growing unease gnawed at him. These maps weren't just references, they were guides. Someone or something had been marking trails, anticipating movement, and maybe even directing it. As they prepared to leave, one tracker swore he heard faint, distant drumming from deep within the valley. Carver strained to listen, but the sound vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the steady drip of water from the cave roof. 2 days later, on July 10th, Carver made another discovery that rattled even the most skeptical investigators. While surveying a collapsed section of the riverbank, he spotted a scrap of faded fabric tangled among exposed roots. Digging carefully, he unearthed a partially burned journal sealed in a waterproof pouch. Its cover scorched but intact enough to read the initials embossed on the inside. D.P. It belonged to Daniel Price. Most of the pages were destroyed by moisture and fire damage, but fragments of entries remained legible. The earliest notes described the group's excitement, their jokes about the heat, and Maya sketching butterflies while Lucas dared Aaron to swim in the river. But halfway through the surviving section, the tone shifted. "Heard drumming again last night, not thunder, closer, rhythmic." Another page mentioned strange voices at dusk. "Lucas says it's hunters. Doesn't sound like Khmer. Aaron disagrees. says she saw something in the trees, tall, unmoving, watching us. There was a crude sketch of 3 concentric circles around a black dot, annotated simply, "Symbols everywhere." Who marks these? But the final entry chilled Carver to his core. "We heard drums again last night, louder this time. Lucas says they're watching us." The date on that last page was June 14th, the same day Maya posted the oil lamp photo. Carver sealed the journal and delivered it to Colonel Somchai personally. But that night, he admitted something unsettling to Henry in private. Daniel's handwriting, it gets shaky near the end, like he was writing in the dark or hiding. The discovery deepened the mystery, but it also confirmed the worst fear creeping into everyone's mind. Whatever happened out there, the group wasn't just lost. By July 13th, the investigation had reached an impasse. No bodies, no definitive clues. And yet, as Carver and his team dug deeper, they kept hearing the same unsettling stories whispered by locals, stories older than any police records. An elder named Somchai, living in a weather-worn stilt house at the edge of the Tatai River, told them of a nearby settlement called Veal Tom. In the late 1960s, he claimed, every inhabitant vanished overnight, nearly 60 men, women, and children. When neighboring villages sent scouts to investigate, they found bowls of rice still steaming over fires, laundry still hanging in the humid night air, but no people. "They leave," the elder said in quiet Khmer, his voice thin as the jungle rain. "Sometimes the forest calls them, sometimes they do not come back." Another story emerged about Phnom Kravan, a mountain settlement abandoned in the 1980s. Rescuers investigating the empty homes reported strange markings carved into doorframes and fence posts, spiraled triangles, identical to those at the hikers' campsite. According to folklore, those symbols were warnings. They marked boundaries not to be crossed. Carver compared archived ranger maps with these accounts and found something chilling. 4 abandoned villages within a 30-mile radius of where Daniel's journal was discovered. At each site, photographs showed the same spiraled patterns etched into stones, trees, and huts, symbols spanning decades, untouched by time or weather. Locals avoided these areas entirely. Even hired trackers refused to enter after sunset. One muttered to Carver before leaving camp for good, "The ones who mark the trees, they still walk at night." The deeper Carver pushed into the jungle, the clearer the pattern became. The friend's path, the campsite, the carved trees, the cave maps. All roads seemed to lead toward the same untouched heart of the Cardamom Mountains. And if the legends were true, something, or someone, had been waiting there for generations. 2 days later, a new lead surfaced, this time from an unexpected source. A former forestry officer named Kosal Van, now living under a false identity near Phnom Penh, contacted Carver through an encrypted messaging app. His first words were direct. "I know who marks the symbols." Kosal claimed he once worked deep inside the Cardamom interior during a government survey in 2009. According to him, his team stumbled across a hidden settlement not marked on any map. It was small, less than 50 people, but highly organized with bamboo structures, ceremonial altars, and carved totems identical to the symbols found at the campsite. They called themselves the Chosen Canopy, Kosal said. They believe the jungle is alive, that it speaks. Outsiders who see the signs, they're tested. According to Kosal, the sect lured outsiders in through visions, chants, and hallucinogenic rituals, claiming to show them the path. Once someone entered the settlement, they were rarely seen again. Kosal described drums that echoed through the trees for miles, synchronized chanting, and nights when entire hillsides seemed to glow with moving lights. When Carver relayed this to Colonel Somchai, the colonel dismissed it outright. "Jungle cults," he scoffed. "Every lost hiker breeds a new ghost story." But Carver noticed something Somchai didn't. Kosal sent photos. Grainy, distorted by age, but unmistakable. Altars carved with the exact same spiraled symbols that had haunted this investigation from the start. Then Kosal said something that made Carver's stomach tighten. "If your hikers saw the lights, they're already theirs." Hours later, Kosal vanished offline. His number disconnected. No trace of him ever surfaced again. On July 17th, investigators received unexpected data from one of the motion-triggered wildlife cameras set up near the hikers' abandoned campsite. The devices were initially deployed to monitor movement in hopes of catching traces of poachers or wildlife trafficking activity. But what they captured just past 3 a.m. on June 15, 2018, one day after the group's last confirmed sighting, sent chills through the investigation. At first, the audio seemed distorted by rain and static, faint insect buzzing undercut by the rush of a nearby river. But as the volume was amplified, patterns emerged. Voices, not one or two, but several, layered, rhythmic, and uncomfortably synchronized, as though chanting. The tones rose and fell in deliberate cadence, unlike any Khmer dialect the translators recognized. One segment, just 12 seconds long, repeated a low phrase 3 times before ending abruptly, as though cut mid-breath. Linguistic experts from Phnom Penh University examined the file. They ruled out Khmer, Vietnamese, Lao, and Thai. Even international consultants specializing in indigenous dialects couldn't identify the source. "The cadence is human," one professor remarked uneasily, "but the structure isn't. It's like someone speaking backwards." The camera itself triggered multiple times that night. But when investigators reviewed the footage, there was nothing to see. No figures, no animals, only swaying leaves and shadow. Worse still, technicians analyzing the timestamps noticed something inexplicable. After the chanting stopped, the device stopped logging data for 47 minutes. When it resumed recording, the internal clock was perfectly synced, suggesting no malfunction. Yet during that gap, the rainforest went utterly silent on every nearby microphone. No birds, no frogs, no crickets. Carver listened to the file alone late that night. He didn't tell anyone, but he recognized something faint beneath the chanting, an irregular rhythm. It wasn't coming from voices at all, but from drums. 7 years later, in August 2025, the jungle gave back one of its secrets. A fisherman along the Kopau River spotted a thin, disoriented figure stumbling along the muddy bank, his skin burned and blistered, his clothes reduced to rags. At first, the villagers thought he was a wandering logger, but when they saw his face, hollow and pale beneath a mat of tangled hair, they called authorities immediately. It was Daniel Price. He collapsed before medics arrived, his body dangerously malnourished, his frame little more than bone. Dozens of deep scars crossed his back, shoulders, and legs. Some healed, others fresh. Insects had burrowed beneath several wounds. At the nearest provincial clinic, Daniel resisted sedatives and clawed at the IV lines, flinching whenever nurses touched him. His first lucid words, spoken in a hoarse rasp to the attending officer, froze everyone in the room. "Don't go back there." Doctors reported signs of prolonged starvation and exposure to hallucinogens, though Daniel denied drinking anything unfamiliar. He refused solid food at first, demanding only water and covering his ears whenever someone raised their voice above a whisper. Authorities pressed him for details about his 3 missing friends, but Daniel avoided answering, staring instead at the tree line outside the clinic's window. After several minutes of silence, he finally whispered something that made even the officers exchange uneasy glances. "They're still out there, watching the river." Within hours, Daniel was transferred under police supervision to a secure medical facility. Media outlets flooded the area, demanding answers, but investigators gave none. Colonel Samchai issued a single statement. The case is no longer considered closed. August 18, 2025. Daniel Price lay on a hospital bed in Phnom Penh's Royal Medical Center, hooked to a web of IV lines, as doctors crowded around his chart. What they found unsettled even the most experienced trauma specialists. Daniel showed clear evidence of long-term malnutrition. His weight had dropped to just 47 kilos, dangerously low for his frame. Blood work revealed severe vitamin deficiencies, signs of dehydration, and recurring infections likely caused by exposure to unsanitary water, but it was the other findings that puzzled them. Along Daniel's arms, chest, and back were hundreds of fine, deliberate scars. Some formed patterns, intersecting lines and spirals etched so shallowly they seemed almost ritualistic. When doctors asked how he'd gotten them, Daniel wouldn't answer, pulling the hospital gown tighter around his shoulders. Toxicology reports uncovered residual compounds in his bloodstream, alkaloids and psychoactive derivatives consistent with certain hallucinogenic plants native to the cardamom interior. Yet these weren't recreational doses. These were controlled exposures, prolonged and repeated over months, maybe years. When doctors tried administering sedatives to calm his worsening anxiety, Daniel violently resisted, nearly tearing the IV from his arm. His voice was hoarse but urgent as he whispered to the nurse leaning over him, "That's how they control you." He refused any unfamiliar medication, accepting only water and small bites of plain rice. At night, nurses reported him waking drenched in sweat, heart pounding, muttering broken fragments in both English and Khmer. One phrase came up repeatedly, "Don't look at the lights." Despite constant monitoring, Daniel often sat cross-legged on the bed for hours, staring at the far corner of the room, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. After 48 hours, investigators were cleared to question him. Doctors warned them he was fragile, but Colonel Somchai insisted, "If he's talking, we need answers now." The interrogation room was small, sterile, and cold. Daniel sat hunched in a loose gray shirt, hands trembling against the metal table. Across from him, Colonel Somchai and Jack Carver waited in silence while the recorder clicked on. The questioning lasted 14 hours. At first, Daniel said nothing, eyes fixed on the camera in the corner. When Somchai pressed him about Maya, Lucas, and Aaron, he shook his head violently, curling in on himself like a child. "They took us," he finally whispered. Carver leaned forward. "Who, Daniel?" "Who took you?" Daniel's breathing quickened, his pupils dilating under the harsh fluorescent lights. He gripped the table until his knuckles turned white. "I can't," he rasped, voice cracking. "They'll hear me." Somchai glanced at Carver, frowning. "Hear you from where?" Daniel's response was nearly inaudible, but the recorder caught it. "The forest carries everything." When asked where the others were, Daniel refused to answer. He pressed his palms to his ears and rocked slightly, muttering the same words over and over. "Not safe here, not safe here, not safe here." By the 6th hour, his agitation worsened. When Carver placed a photo of the spiraled tree symbols in front of him, Daniel froze. His lips parted, but no words came. He stared at the image until tears welled in his eyes, then whispered, "If you've seen them, they've already seen you." After 14 grueling hours, doctors terminated the session. Daniel was returned to his room under sedation, despite his protests, thrashing violently until the medication took hold. That night, the recording of his interview was sent to 3 separate analysis teams. But one section of audio troubled investigators most. Faintly, in the background, there was something else on the tape. A low, rhythmic drumming, steady, deliberate, and impossible to explain. August 22, 2025. On his 4th day in the secure ward, Daniel finally began to speak. It wasn't during an interrogation. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes unfocused, talking softly to himself. Nurse recordings later captured the first coherent fragments of his story. "We didn't find them," he whispered. "They found us." According to Daniel, on the 2nd day after leaving the market, the group followed what they thought was an animal trail, down into a valley choked with banyan roots and mist. That's where they first saw the settlement, a cluster of bamboo huts suspended above the forest floor, connected by rope bridges and platforms almost invisible from above. The people there, about 40 in total, were barefoot, their bodies streaked with ash and ochre paint. They wore no modern clothing, only wraps of woven fiber. None of them spoke at first, but they watched the hikers with silent intensity, eyes reflecting torchlight, even in the daytime. Daniel claimed they were invited inside, given food and clean water, and told to rest. At first, the settlement felt strangely peaceful, a sanctuary deep within an untouched wilderness. It felt like stepping back in time, he said, like we'd crossed into another world. But that night, things changed. Daniel said he woke to the sound of drums echoing through the valley, steady and deliberate. When he crawled to the edge of the platform, he saw people gathering around a central fire. Dozens moved in slow, synchronized steps, chanting in that same unrecognizable language recorded on the wildlife camera. They called it the beginning, Daniel murmured, the night of seeing. When Carver later pressed him to explain what seeing meant, Daniel's lips trembled. "You don't want to see," he whispered, his voice breaking, "not what they showed us." Daniel described the first night in vivid, fractured detail, as though every moment had been seared into his memory. They were brought to the central fire, surrounded by silent onlookers wearing masks made of woven palm leaves, their faces painted with spiraled markings identical to the ones carved into the trees. An elder, a gaunt figure with long silver hair and eyes like polished stone, approached the four hikers. He handed each of them a bamboo cup filled with a thick, bitter liquid that smelled of earth and resin. "They said we couldn't leave until we'd seen the light," Daniel recalled, his voice shaking. "Said the forest would show us the truth." Lucas refused at first, muttering angrily that they should go. But before he could argue further, two masked figures stepped forward, gripping him firmly by the arms. One pressed the cup to his lips, while the other whispered something Daniel couldn't understand. Lucas spat the liquid back out, and that's when everything shifted. Drums thundered louder, chants rose to a fever pitch, and the entire commune seemed to close in around them. Daniel, Maya, and Aaron drank under pressure, their throats burning as the mixture took hold within minutes. Vision blurred, sound fractured, and light swam across their sight, strange, shifting glows pulsing within the tree line, too symmetrical to be natural. Daniel remembered collapsing onto the earth as figures danced around him, their masks tilting unnaturally, their shadows stretching impossibly long in the firelight. He swore the ground itself began to breathe beneath his palms, warm and alive, vibrating with the rhythm of the drums. Then Lucas screamed. Daniel opened his eyes just long enough to see him struggling, kicking violently as four masked figures dragged him beyond the river, their words sharp, ritualistic. When Daniel asked what they meant, one masked woman leaned close and whispered something that froze him to his core. Only the willing return. Lucas never came back. When Daniel finally began describing the commune's beliefs, his voice dropped to almost a whisper, as though afraid the walls themselves might be listening. They called themselves the Chosen Canopy, he said. They believe the forest is alive, not just alive or conscious, a god. Everything here, the trees, the rivers, the soil, is one body, one mind. The commune believed they were its caretakers, chosen to protect its secrets and expand its reach. At the center of their doctrine was a figure they referred to as Preya Chaneang, the Root Father, an ancient forest deity said to inhabit the deepest uncharted valleys. According to their chants, the canopy itself whispered to them, guiding their every action. Outsiders, Daniel explained, were not considered enemies, but neither were they free to leave. "They said we were brought there for a reason," he murmured, "that we had been called by the forest." Each newcomer was given two choices. The first was surrender, to drink, to accept the rituals, and to become part of the canopy. Those who complied were promised visions of the true path, an awakening that would let them walk between worlds. The second choice was silence, refusal, and those who resisted, Daniel said flatly, "Feed the roots." When Carver asked him what that meant, Daniel hesitated before replying. "They believe death isn't an ending, it's recycling. They bury people under sacred trees so their bodies become nutrients. Returning the lost to the living, they called it. Somchai leaned forward. And Lucas? Daniel looked away, shaking his head. They said he wouldn't walk the path. He was offered back. At this point, Daniel pressed his palms to his ears, rocking slightly. Don't follow the lights, he muttered under his breath. That's how they choose you. According to Daniel, the night Aaron vanished began with whispers, muffled voices outside their bamboo hut, masked figures pacing the platforms. By then Lucas was gone, and tension inside the settlement was suffocating. Maya cried quietly in the corner, clutching her knees, while Aaron stared out through the gaps in the woven walls, expression unreadable. When the drums started again, Daniel knew something was coming. He and Maya had begun plotting escape days earlier, memorizing trails and watching guard rotations. But Aaron had been distant, withdrawn, almost too calm. That night, she finally spoke. I'll get them away from you, she said simply. Run when I tell you. Before Daniel could protest, Aaron slipped outside, barefoot and silent. Moments later, shouting erupted near the central fire. Daniel crept to the edge of the platform and saw her standing defiantly before two guards, waving a burning torch in the air, screaming in broken Khmer words she didn't understand. Dozens turned toward her. Chaos exploded. Daniel grabbed Maya's hand, and together they bolted across the rope bridge, hearts hammering as they plunged into the blackness of the jungle beyond. Behind them, the chanting turned frantic, the drums accelerating into a violent rhythm. Then came Aaron's scream, piercing, sharp, and abruptly cut short. Daniel never saw her again. Even now, years later, he refuses to describe that sound in detail. When Carver pressed him for more, Daniel whispered only one thing. She didn't die, not right away. Daniel's voice cracked when he finally spoke about Maya. After Aaron's sacrifice, the jungle swallowed them whole. Daniel and Maya stumbled blindly through dense undergrowth, following faint game trails and the sound of distant rivers. The first week was survival by instinct alone, drinking from muddy pools, scraping insects from tree bark, eating unripe fruit that made them sick. By the second week, exhaustion set in. Maya's feet were torn and blistered, her legs crisscrossed with cuts from thorny vines. They avoided fire for fear the commune might spot smoke, sleeping under dripping leaves while the constant hum of insects gnawed at their sanity. Then, on the 12th day, it happened. While climbing over a rotting log, Maya screamed, a sharp, sudden cry that sent birds scattering from the canopy. Daniel saw the culprit slithering into the shadows, a broad-banded crate, one of the most venomous snakes in Southeast Asia. Within hours, Maya's breathing grew shallow. Her skin burned with fever, and the infection spread rapidly through the bite wound, despite Daniel's desperate attempts to clean it with river water. By the third day, she could barely speak. She kept apologizing, Daniel whispered, his fists clenched, like she thought slowing me down was her fault. On the morning of the fourth day, she didn't wake up. Daniel buried Maya beneath a massive strangler fig along the riverbank. But when he began clearing earth for the shallow grave, he froze. Carved into the trunk above him was the spiraled triangle symbol, identical to those on the commune's trees, untouched and weathered by time. It was like they already knew, Daniel said, his voice hollow, like the forest had marked her. He covered the grave with stones and vines to hide it from sight. Before leaving, he whispered a promise he would break 100 times in the years that followed. I'll come back for you. For the next 5 years, Daniel lived like a shadow inside the Cardamom wilderness, constantly moving between riverbanks, caves, and forgotten hunting trails. He avoided both the commune and the outside world. Sometimes he'd hear distant voices carried on the wind, poachers shouting, gunshots cracking like thunder, and he'd vanish into the undergrowth, leaving no trace behind. Other times, he swore he heard drums at night, faint and deliberate, reverberating through the ground as if the forest itself was breathing. Daniel became expert at survival. He caught river fish using sharpened bamboo stakes, foraged for wild mangosteens and palm hearts, and trapped monitor lizards when fruit was scarce. He collected rainwater in carved bamboo tubes and learned to recognize poisonous plants by the curling veins on their leaves. But even in solitude, the commune's presence haunted him. He discovered strange markers deep in the interior, spiraled triangles carved into rocks, bones arranged deliberately at river crossings, and crude totems hanging from branches like silent warnings. "They were everywhere," Daniel said softly, "but I never saw them, not once. That was worse. Isolation twisted time. Weeks bled into months, months into years." Daniel stopped counting his age, stopped marking days. He described waking some nights convinced someone was standing over him, only to find footprints in the mud come morning, small, bare, and recent. Worse still were the lights. Some nights, across the river or beyond the ridge, pale blue glows would drift silently between the trees. They never flickered, never wavered, and Daniel never dared get closer. "I learned their rule," he whispered to Carver during his debriefing. "Don't follow the lights. That's how they find you." 5 years passed before he saw another human face. By then, he wasn't sure he was human anymore. September 2025. After weeks of treatment and debriefings, Daniel agreed to lead Cambodian authorities, accompanied by Jack Carver, back to the area where he claimed the commune had lived. Satellite coordinates were cross-referenced against Daniel's descriptions of landmarks. The river's curve, the limestone ridges, the valley carved into the canopy like a hollowed-out scar. But as the helicopters set down on a narrow clearing and the search teams advanced through the dense undergrowth, unease grew with every step. "This is it," Daniel whispered as they approached. "This is where they were." But there was nothing there. Where Daniel swore he'd once seen 40 bamboo huts suspended high above the forest floor, there was now only empty space. The rope bridges, the wooden platforms, the ceremonial fire pits, all gone. The ground was smooth, untouched, as though no one had ever lived there. Carver paced the clearing, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. Then one of the rangers called out from the west edge of the site, voice tight with disbelief. "Sir, you need to see this." Scattered across the forest floor were dozens of perfect stone circles, each arranged with unsettling precision. Some were small, no wider than a backpack. Others spanned several meters. Inside each ring, the earth was unnaturally dark, as if something had burned there long ago. But the most disturbing detail was what surrounded them. Every single tree trunk within a 100-meter radius bore spiraled triangle carvings, hundreds of them, gouged deep into the wood, old scars overlaid with fresh ones. Some symbols were so recently carved, the bark still wept sap. Daniel collapsed to his knees, shaking his head violently. "It's here," he muttered, voice breaking. "I know it's here." Carver exchanged a glance with Somchai. The clearing was silent, too silent. Whatever had once been there was gone. In late September, forensic teams analyzed samples collected from the carved tree symbols, hoping to find traces of resin or tool marks that might identify the commune's techniques. Instead, what they found left the investigation spiraling into deeper mystery. Inside the grooves of several carvings, scientists detected human DNA embedded in hardened tree sap. At first, it was assumed the cuts had caused someone's blood to mix naturally with the oozing resin. But the analysis didn't support that theory. The ratios were unnatural. Experts discovered consistently high concentrations of human hemoglobin, as though blood had been deliberately mixed with the sap before the symbols were etched. "This wasn't accidental," said Dr. Vichaya Tan, the lead biogeneticist. "Someone, or several people, used blood as part of a binding agent, purposefully." The findings triggered heated debates inside the task force. Some investigators theorized the commune performed rituals meant to mark territory using blood, connecting to Daniel's claims of spiritual beliefs tied to the canopy. Others believed something more sinister, that these markings were warnings or instructions. When Carver relayed the results to Daniel, the reaction was immediate. His breathing became erratic, pupils dilating as he gripped the edges of his chair. "They're not gone," he whispered. "They just moved." Somchai tried to press him for details, but Daniel shook his head violently, curling into himself. "You don't understand," he rasped. "The symbols aren't warnings, they're invitations." Despite weeks of searching, no physical evidence of the commune's existence was ever recovered. No bones, no discarded tools, no artifacts, nothing but stone circles, symbols, and the eerie knowledge that blood had been deliberately fed to the forest itself. Officially, the case remains open. Unofficially, it has become something else entirely. Not a missing persons investigation, a territory dispute, and no one dares enter the valley after dark. By October 2025, just weeks after the discovery of the blood-soaked carvings, the entire investigation was abruptly shut down. Cambodian authorities cited insufficient evidence and environmental risks as justification for halting operations in the Cardamom Mountains. Privately, everyone knew that wasn't the real reason. Satellite imagery of the so-called Forbidden Zone mysteriously disappeared from official databases. Drone footage from the search operations was locked under national security restrictions. Even forensic reports about the DNA findings were quietly retracted, replaced by vague summaries that contradicted earlier results. Jack Carver pressed Colonel Somchai for answers, but the colonel avoided every question, repeating the same line over and over. "The case is closed." Daniel wasn't convinced. He spent nights pacing his hospital room, replaying every memory, every detail of the commune, the rituals, the lights. He begged Carver to keep searching, but the ex-tracker hesitated. Then, late one evening, as Daniel was preparing to be discharged from the secure medical wing, an investigator slipped quietly into his room. He didn't give his name. He didn't sit down. He simply handed Daniel a folded piece of paper and whispered, "Stop digging." Daniel frowned, confused. Why? The man's eyes flicked toward the security camera before leaning close enough for Daniel to feel his breath. "Because if you keep looking, they'll come looking for you." Before Daniel could respond, the investigator turned and left. The note he'd handed over was blank. 2 days later, that man resigned from the force. No one saw him again. For months, Daniel tried to convince himself that the warning was paranoia, nothing more. He moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Phnom Penh, staying off social media, changing his phone number, and avoiding public places. At night, though, the jungle never left him. He dreamed of spiraled triangles carved into endless rows of trees, of lights pulsing silently across the canopy, of errands screaming somewhere he could never reach. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced he was still being watched. Then, one December evening, as he returned home from a late grocery run, Daniel froze in the hallway outside his apartment. There, scratched faintly into the wood of his doorframe, was the symbol. A spiraled triangle, perfectly symmetrical, fresh. Daniel staggered backward, heart pounding, his grocery bag spilling onto the floor. No one had been in his apartment, he was certain of it, and yet someone had been close enough to mark his door without being seen. He called Carver immediately, but the ex-tracker didn't answer. That night, Daniel shoved a dresser against his door and sat awake until dawn, a knife gripped in his hand, staring at the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. He didn't sleep for 3 days. And when he finally did, he woke to find something else outside his door. A single stone, smooth and round, placed deliberately in the center of his welcome mat, the kind they used in the circles. January 2026. Just as the investigation was fading from the headlines, an anonymous package arrived at Jack Carver's Phnom Penh address. Inside was a single item, an SD card, unmarked and wrapped in an evidence bag, dated June 2018. Forensics confirmed it belonged to Lucas Tran's old GoPro, last seen at the campsite. Somehow, it had been withheld from official reports, deliberately. Carver and Colonel Somchai arranged a private viewing. A monitor flickered to life in a dimly lit briefing room, the footage grainy but intact. The first clips were harmless, laughing selfies, Maya sketching by the river, Aaron balancing on a fallen log. Then came the final file, time-stamped June 14, 2018, 3:14 a.m. The video opened inside the hiker's tent. Lucas was whispering, voice shaky. Something's outside. The faint rustling of leaves followed, then distant drums, slow and deliberate. A flashlight beam cut through the nylon tent walls, illuminating moving shadows beyond. Daniel's voice came next, trembling. Don't unzip it. Seconds later, the camera shifted as Lucas leaned toward the flap and froze. Through the thin fabric, several tall silhouettes stood perfectly still in the darkness. Then the chanting started. Low-layered voices rose around the tent, the same unidentifiable language captured by the wildlife cameras. The camera's microphone peaked as the noise escalated, frantic, rhythmic, inhuman. Suddenly, the tent walls shook violently. The GoPro slipped from Lucas's hand, the footage blurring into chaos as someone screamed. The last clear frame before the video cut to black showed a hooded figure, inches from the lens, spiraled markings carved across its face. The file ended abruptly. Carver looked at Daniel across the table. He was pale, trembling. "That's the night they took us," Daniel whispered. March 2026. With international media swarming Phnom Penh and documentary crews preparing to release a feature on the case, Daniel Price vanished again. He left no note, no signs of forced entry. 3 days later, Maya's brother received a voicemail from an unknown number. The recording lasted only 7 seconds, Daniel's voice faint, ragged, and trembling. "We were never lost. We were chosen." In the background, barely audible, was the low thrum of drums, steady, distant, deliberate. Authorities traced the call to a cell tower near the eastern edge of the Cardamom Mountains, less than 15 kilometers from the Forbidden Zone. But when search teams mobilized, they found nothing. No footprints, no discarded gear, no Daniel. 2 weeks later, the investigative documentary Into the Canopy premiered worldwide. The final frame lingered on Daniel's last known words as the sound of distant chanting built slowly beneath them. The screen faded to black. No one has entered the Forbidden Zone since. And yet, locals report that on certain humid nights, drums can still be heard rolling through the jungle, carried low on the wind, always coming from the west. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.